What if I told you that in medieval Europe, the oldest profession came with the highest risk of ending up headless, diseased, or dumped in a river wearing nothing but shame? Yeah, being a male prostitute back then wasn't the sexy rebellion you might think. It was more like playing roulette with your soul, your body, and the church's patience all at once. See, when people imagine medieval prostitution, they think of dimly lit brothels, lace corsets, and mysterious women serving knights and drunk merchants. But men? They were there too, quietly existing in the shadows of society's filthiest hypocrisy. The same nobles who condemned them were often their clients, and yet these men were branded, beaten, and sometimes burned for the exact same thing everyone else was doing behind closed doors. Today, we're diving deep into that grimy, sweaty, hypocritical underbelly of medieval life. The world where sex, sin, and survival collided in ways that make Game of Thrones look like Sunday school. So if you enjoy dark corners of history and want to feel better about your own miserable job, make sure to subscribe. Because by the end of this, you'll realize medieval sex work makes modern burnout look like a spa day. Let's get right into it. Number 10. The sin business. Picture this. You're a poor man in a medieval city, broke, hungry, and desperate. The church says you're worthless, your Lord ignores you, and the only thing you've got left to sell is yourself. Congratulations. You're now in the sin business, officially hated by God and underpaid by everyone else. Male prostitution existed, but barely acknowledged. While women were tolerated in designated brothels, as long as the city could tax them, men were viewed as moral poison. Medieval law books didn't even have a polite word for them. They were simply sodomites. And sodomy wasn't just frowned upon, it was criminalized, sometimes punishable by fire. Yet here's the cosmic joke. Priests, nobles, and even kings were often among their secret clientele. So while preachers yelled about purity, they were sneaking off to buy exactly what they condemned. It's like your boss banning office romance while making out with the intern during lunch breaks. For most male sex workers, the only safe way to operate was under disguise, pretending to be companions, servants, or actors. But one wrong rumor, one jealous rival, and suddenly, you're not a person anymore. You're a walking sin waiting to be purged. Basically, in medieval Europe, being a male prostitute was like working at a haunted Starbucks run by inquisitors. Lots of tips, but none worth dying for. Number 9. The brothel hierarchy. You might think brothels were chaotic dens of lust where everyone was equal in misery. Oh no. Even in the sex industry, the patriarchy made sure men were bottom tier. Most brothels were legally controlled by city officials or the church. Women were regulated because they were considered necessary, a moral outlet for men, according to church logic. But male prostitutes, they weren't sanctioned. They were corrupters. So if you were caught in a female brothel, you could be whipped for moral contamination. If you worked in an all-male one, you could be executed. Some men tried to operate independently, offering private entertainments to nobles or monks. Others were enslaved or trafficked, especially in Mediterranean ports, where Venetian and Florentine elites secretly kept beautiful boys as status symbols. Think of it like a twisted medieval version of OnlyFans, except your subscribers could literally kill you for existing. There are surviving court records from the 14th century Italy describing these pleasure houses for men, coded with phrases like houses of shame or dens of vice. Police raids often ended in brutal public trials, and if the workers were lucky, they'd only get exiled. If unlucky, burned. So yeah, while female brothels were bad, male ones were like playing Russian roulette naked, except the bullet was usually the law, and your survival depended on who you were servicing that night. Number 8. The disease lottery. If the law didn't kill you, disease probably would. The medieval world had zero concept of hygiene, and even less compassion for people who worked in sex. Male prostitutes were often untreated for infections, since doctors refused to touch sodomites. There were no condoms, unless you count sheep intestines tied with string, which, yes, was a real thing. Syphilis spread like wildfire, especially after the late 1400s, and was called the French disease, no matter what country you lived in, because blaming France was the medieval version of saying it's not my fault. And since most men couldn't afford healers, they turned to folk remedies, vinegar baths, mercury ointments, and holy water enemas. Don't ask. The irony? The same priests who cursed them for sin often made money selling those bogus cures. Bodies rotted, voices rasped, and yet the demand didn't stop. The brothel kept spinning, men were disposable, and once they became visibly ill, they were tossed out like spoiled meat, sometimes into the streets, sometimes into unmarked graves. It was capitalism before capitalism. No labor rights, no safety nets, just a medieval version of gig work, where the gig was your body and the deadline was your last breath. Number 7. The church's hypocritical obsession. If you think the church just didn't approve of sex work, oh no, it was obsessed with it. Like, I hate it so much I can't stop thinking about it, levels of obsession. Male prostitution, in particular, became the ultimate moral panic. Church sermons thundered about men defiling men, while the same clergy secretly kept their own companions. There are historical records from Avignon and Florence describing inquisitors investigating male brothels, and then quietly paying visits to them later. Talk about research. One infamous 13th century bishop, Guillaume of Paris, gave weekly sermons about the sin of sodomy, while his cathedral choir boys were literally being sold as private entertainers to noblemen. The hypocrisy was thicker than the incense smoke. Publicly, the church blamed the sodomites for everything: plague, famine, even bad weather. Private confessions, however, tell a much uglier truth. Priests themselves were among the most common clients. Some even confessed to using church money to pay for male sex workers, only to turn around and condemn those same men to the flames. Basically, it was a moral circus where the ringmaster was the dirtiest of them all. You were both the sinner and the scapegoat. The church got to enjoy you and punish you for existing. That's not just hypocrisy. That's spiritual gaslighting on a holy scale. So next time someone says medieval Europe was guided by Christian virtue, just remember, behind every sermon was a brothel receipt. Number 6. The street work gamble. For men too poor or too frightened to work in brothels, there was only one option left: the streets. Picture it: dark alleys, cold wind, and guards who'd beat you just for standing around too long. Street prostitution was technically illegal, but the cities turned a blind eye, as long as it stayed out of sight and didn't scare the nobles' horses. Male sex workers haunted bridges, taverns, and bathhouses. Bathhouses, especially, were hotbeds, literally, of illicit business. They started as places for hygiene, but quickly turned into what one chronicler called a devil's playground of naked temptation. Street work meant constant risk. You could be robbed by clients, arrested by guards, or lynched by mobs for moral cleansing. The irony? Many of those mobs were led by the same men who'd been your clients the week before. One infamous case in 15th century Florence tells of a young man named Luca, who made a living selling himself to wealthy merchants. When one of his regulars was caught in a church scandal, Luca was dragged through the streets and flogged to death because someone had to pay for the embarrassment, and it sure wasn't going to be the guy with money. Being a male prostitute in medieval Europe wasn't just degrading, it was suicidal. You had to flirt with danger in the literal sense. And the best-case scenario? You got paid and didn't die that week. So yeah, when historians call it survival sex, they mean it very literally. Number 5. The gender paradox. Here's the twist. While men in brothels were condemned, women doing the same work were often tolerated. Why? Because medieval society couldn't decide if sex was a sin or a service, the church saw women as necessary evils, the outlet that kept men from committing greater sins with other men. So female brothels were taxed, supervised, and occasionally even blessed. Male sex work, on the other hand, was considered an abomination, not because of the act itself, but because it flipped gender roles upside down. A man submitting was seen as losing his masculinity, and in medieval logic, that was basically cosmic treason. You weren't just a sinner, you were a failed man. Authorities described male prostitutes as perverted imitators of women and souls who forget their station. Meanwhile, the actual clients, rich, powerful, and male, were rarely punished. They were tempted, not corrupted. Sound familiar? It's the same old script. Blame the poor, protect the powerful. So while women were used, men were erased. You couldn't even exist without being both invisible and infamous. And if you think that's confusing, imagine explaining it to your confessor while he secretly tries to book a session for later. In short, being a male prostitute was a social paradox, wrapped in religious guilt, sprinkled with existential dread, or as medieval theologians might put it, an abomination most foul. Number 4, the punishment theater. When male sex workers got caught, the punishment wasn't just about justice. It was entertainment. Public executions of sodomites were common in cities like Florence, Venice, and Paris. But these weren't quiet affairs. They were theatrical spectacles meant to purify society. Imagine being paraded through town with a sign labeling you the devil's whore, then burned alive while the crowd threw rotten food. It was cruelty wrapped in morality. Records from the 14th century show that some cities even staged symbolic executions, making the condemned wear mock crowns or fake wings before being killed, as if to mock their fallen angel status. Others were castrated first to remove the source of sin, because apparently medieval justice loved irony as much as suffering. But here's the dark part. These public burnings were also warnings. They reminded everyone that sin was visible and contagious. People were terrified not just of hell, but of guilt by association. So even friends or lovers of accused men often vanished, afraid of being next. And yet, despite all this terror, the trade continued, because the demand never stopped. Every sermon that condemned sodomy just made the word spread farther and curiosity grow stronger. The church was its own best marketing department. If hell had a PR team, medieval Europe was running it. Number 3, the client list from hell. So who were the clients? Let's just say, not the type of people who'd want their names on a medieval Yelp review. Royal courtiers, priests, merchants, and knights were the usual suspects. The same men who publicly funded witch hunts and moral reforms were sneaking through alleyways to pay for forbidden pleasure. It was hypocrisy wrapped in velvet cloaks. In Venice, there were rumors of entire noble circles who specialized in boy banquets, where young men were paraded like fine wine, tasted, traded, discarded. Chroniclers wrote about nobles keeping male pages, not for service, but for nightly amusement. And if you were young, beautiful, and poor, you didn't need a resume. You needed luck and survival instincts. Even monarchs got caught in the act. King Edward II of England was infamously accused of doting on his favorite, Piers Gaveston. Their relationship, whether romantic or political, enraged the nobility so much that Gaveston was executed in what was basically a medieval hate crime disguised as treason. The irony? Those same nobles later hired male prostitutes themselves. In monasteries, things were even weirder. Some abbots kept novice companions, officially for spiritual mentorship, but historians have noted suspicious records of shared beds and unexplained gifts. Priests were supposed to be celibate, but that rule applied only when people were looking. For male sex workers, rich clients meant survival, but also risk. If the affair was exposed, the noble paid a fine or made a pilgrimage. The prostitute, tortured or executed. So while the church preached salvation, men like these lived one confession away from damnation, both eternal and immediate. It's almost poetic in a tragic, blood-stained kind of way. The powerful bought pleasure, and the powerless paid the price. Number 2. The psychological abyss. Forget the physical misery for a moment. Imagine the mental toll. You lived every day pretending you weren't what you were. You hid your body, your name, your voice. Every glance from a stranger could mean desire or death. The church told you that you were damned. Society told you that you were disgusting. Even your own clients treated you like a dirty secret. There was no community, no solidarity, no support network. Women in brothels sometimes formed sisterhoods, a kind of tragic family. Men didn't have that luxury. They worked alone, moved constantly, and lied to survive. It wasn't just dangerous, it was lonely. And the shame, it was weaponized. The church taught that sodomy stained the soul, a mark no confession could erase. Imagine being told that just existing made you a walking apocalypse. So you start to believe it. You start to think you deserve the pain. Some historians have found letters, rare, hidden ones, written by men accused of unnatural acts. They don't sound like villains. They sound human, afraid, heartbroken. One wrote, "I only wanted to be touched." Another begged for mercy, promising to serve God forever if spared. He wasn't. Being a male prostitute wasn't just social suicide, it was emotional exile. And yet somehow, these men kept living, loving, and surviving. In a world that saw them as monsters, they still found ways to be human. And maybe that's the darkest tragedy of all, that the most human thing, intimacy, became the one thing they had to die for. Number 1. The forgotten bodies. When these men died, from disease, punishment, or despair, they vanished without names. No graves, no prayers, no history. Their bodies were dumped outside city walls, often burned to purify the ground. The church refused burial rites, claiming the soil itself would be tainted. Families disowned them. Neighbors pretended they never existed. It was historical erasure at its cruelest. Destroy the sinner, then delete his memory. And yet, traces remain. In dusty court ledgers, confession records, and moral treatises filled with panic over men of vice. These scraps are all that's left of hundreds, maybe thousands of lives lost to hypocrisy. We talk about medieval knights and kings, but not the people they used and discarded. We glorify the castles, not the shadows beneath them. But those shadows tell the real story of the men who sold their bodies because they had nothing else, who lived and died in a system that worshipped purity and practiced corruption. If history teaches us anything, it's that the line between sin and survival is drawn by whoever has the power to hold the pen. And that's still true today. We just call it by nicer names. So next time someone says, "the good old days," remember, for some, those days were a living hell dressed up as holiness. That's all for today. I'll be making similar videos in the future. Subscribe to see them.